Hello Year 10 and welcome to English This Week with me, Miss Letts. Today we are focusing on Dirt Work from the letter you sent me last week and the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen. If you hear any random noises in the background, it's because one of my cats is wheezing asthmatically in the corner and the other is chewing on flowers for attention. He might throw up at some point. Warnings have been made. Right. So the first thing you're going to be doing in today's lesson is the dirt work. And the first thing I would like you to do is to reflect on your own piece of writing. So if you don't have that already, can you please get out the work that you did on the letter? Once you've done that, the first task I'd like you to do is to underline any sentences that are more than 3 lines long. If you find that you're doing lots of underlining, then you need to be using full stops securely. It makes your work much more coherent. Secondly, you need to circle each time you begin a sentence with the same word, unless, of course, it's for deliberate effect. And again, if you're circling a lot, you need to focus on varying the way you begin your sentences. Thirdly, highlight and label any techniques you've included. If you find that you haven't highlighted an awful lot, then you need to make sure you're using a wider range of techniques. And finally, in a different colour, highlight any interesting vocabulary choices. Again, if you don't highlight an awful lot, then you need to be making more sophisticated choices here. On the right here, I've written down some effective phrases that I saw from your class. So we've got some interesting arguments, emotive language, effective use of tone, style and register to match the task. You can read through these. And then your Dirt 2 is by using this work from Dirt 1 and my personalised feedback, so your emails, rewrite a section of your response and make sure that you remember to meet your targets. I'd like you to spend about 15 minutes on this task and then we'll move on to exposure. So pause the video now. Okay, exposure by Wilfred Owen. So on the left is a word cloud, and that's when you input the whole poem and it comes up with all the words and their frequency is reflected in the size of the words. So we know that these words are quite prominent throughout the poem. I'd like you just to pause the video and spend a minute or two thinking about what you think this poem is going to be about based on this word cloud. Pause now. Okay, secondly, as always, what are the connotations of the title? So it's called Exposure. Those of you that are interested in photography might immediately think of that. Some of us might say, well, if you're exposed, you're obviously quite vulnerable. You might be unprotected. Exposed to what, though? The enemy, the weather? And that's what we're going to be exploring. So make those annotations around the title of your poem. Next thing we need to make sure we do is focus on the context. We need to know a little bit more about Wilfred Owen. He was an incredibly interesting man. So he is a famous war poet, although most of his poetry wasn't even published until after his death. He enlisted in the army in 1915, and in 1917 he was diagnosed with shell shock, which obviously we would call PTSD now. That was as a result of being thrown by a shell, and he had to spend several days hiding near the corpse of one of his fellow officers, which is obviously incredibly traumatizing. Following the diagnosis, he was sent to a hospital near Edinburgh where he ended up writing many of his poems. He also met another poet, Siegfried Sassoon, and they bonded quite a lot. I think Sassoon inspired him, and I think it might have been Sassoon that published Owen's works after his death. But Owen's poetry was characterised by this kind of bitter tone. He was angry at the cruelty and the waste of war, and angry at the people in charge but weren't actually fighting, the armchair patriots. Anyway, he died in battle aged 25, and it was 1 week before peace was announced in 1918. And I think his parents actually found out on the day that peace was announced that their son had died. So he had an incredibly short life, but his poetry has made a massive impact for its honesty. There was a lot of poetry that was incredibly patriotic at the time and pro-war, I suppose, to inspire people, but his was honest and it revealed the horrors of war. So I'd like you to make notes on these ideas about Wilfred Owen, and I would do that in your anthologies. Right, here's the poem in its entirety. If you were not fortunate enough to collect your anthology and you don't have a printer, I would highly recommend that you do spend the time writing down this poem so that you have a completely annotated one ready for when we do return to school. I know it's quite long. I promise you the next one's quite short. It's only, I don't know, about 20 lines long. So next time it'll be much easier. I might read it to you. Forgive my unpoetic voice though and delivery. Our brains ache, and the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know that war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassy ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we're dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home. Glimpsing the sunk fires glows with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit, for God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath we lie out here. Therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party picks and shovels in shaking grass, pours over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Okay, we're going to take a closer look at each stanza now. So this first one, our brains ache. Immediately, with this inclusive pronoun, Owen establishes that the soldiers are in this together. It unites them, it creates this sense of solidarity. And you've got the personification here, the merciless iced east winds that knife us. We have this idea in war that it's constant battle, constant gunfire, but here Owen's talking about how actually the weather is far more of a threat than the enemy could ever be. And he uses this kind of violent imagery to talk about how merciless and brutal that the winds are. So wearied we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. So you've got this juxtaposition between the flares, the weaponry, and the wind that is knifing them. This is clearly more of a threat. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. And you've got that sibilance there to create this kind of sense of evil and to highlight the quiet, really, I suppose, because nothing happens. And you've got this short sentence here because all of this detail, all of this stuff going on, but nothing happens. And it's the boredom that Owen highlights here as well. Fun AO3 fact. So romantic poetry, which we've looked at before with Blake and Wordsworth, people like that. This one mirrors Keats's poem Ode to a Nightingale, which starts, "My heart aches." And here Owen is kind of subverting the conventions of well-known poetry, like in the Romantic era, because the Romantics never would have imagined something as horrendous as this happening. He does it again later when he personifies dawn as being miserable, and obviously dawn normally symbolises new beginnings and things like that. So, using my ideas and my rambling, make some notes on this stanza, please. You might want to pause the video here. Next stanza. Watching we hear the mad gust tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward incessantly the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? And you've got another simile here, like twitching agonies of men, and the wind is personified. It creates quite a disturbing idea, but it also reveals the psychological state of the soldiers at this point too. They feel separate from this war. It's something far away that they can't really relate to. They're just coping on their survival. And here it's Owen highlighting the futility of war. What are we doing here? He's questioning it. War sounds separate to them. It sounds like something they can't relate to because they're just focusing on survival against nature. Okay, pause here. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army, attacks once more and ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. And again, linking back to that idea of the romantics, you've got dawn being personified as something quite negative, whereas we would expect dawn to symbolise a new beginning. And this idea of war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag story, it's the idea of the repetitive nature of what the soldiers are doing. And here, ranks on shivering ranks of grey, it's the monotony and the physical suffering that the soldiers are having to cope with. And he really reinforces this idea, but nothing happens. These soldiers are waiting for something to happen, but instead they're just having to survive. We have a bit of a tone change here, when sudden successive flights of bullets streak with silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flop, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. So you've got the sibilance here, which is almost mimicking that idea of gunfire. But Owen says the bullets are less deadly than the air, which again highlights the physical challenges they're facing due to the exposure to the weather. And again, it's almost like the wind is an enemy, the wind doesn't care about them. And again, nothing happens. Quite an ominous stanza. Pale flakes with lingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassy ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we're dying? You've got this idea that death is kind of feeling them out as a result of the weather. It's quite sinister, and it shows here how fearful they are. We